So it's, I'm going to introduce Susan McGee in a second to introduce our keynote speaker. But before I do, I want to take a moment to acknowledge Homeward Trust and the host committee from Edmonton who has helped us put this huge conference together. So the coordination of cultural activities, the welcome reception, the orientation, lived experience lounge, a lot of the lived experience engagement, local scholarships, the memorial event that's on this afternoon at 5:30, our push film screening, and a lot more were all brought to you by the host committee. Everything you see in this room the host committee has helped us put together. I want to recognize the members of that host committee, starting with Dawn Diesel-Bilodeau from the Participant Advisory Committee, Pamela Spurvey from the Participant Advisory Committee, Jessica Day, Youth Empowerment and Support Services, Judy Downey, City of Edmonton, Housing and Homelessness, Gail Hayes, the Edmonton Coalition on Housing and Homelessness, Margot Long, Youth Empowerment and Support Services, Rose Mueller, Indigenous Advisory Council, Ian O'Donnell, Downtown Business Association, Mike Van Boom, Capital Region Interfaith Housing Initiative, and Robin Way, Government of Alberta, Community and Social Services. Can you please give our host committee a round of applause? Now the other part of this is that the Homeward Trust has thrown their whole organization into this event, but there are a few folks from Homeward Trust I'd like to recognize, and they're all, I think, somewhere right about there in the front. And I ask them to please stand if they're here. First, Matt Ward, Allison Frolin, Kathy Moran, Amelia Hall, Vivian Kwan, and Liam Thompson, Deb Harmancy, and also when you came in yesterday, there was a little medicine pouch that was on your tables, and those were done by Ken Armstrong and Marissa Nakuchi, and all of that, 1,500 of those little bundles. So please thank Homeward Trust. Now, it's my pleasure to introduce Susan McGee, who is the President and CEO of Homeward Trust. I've said on other occasions, and I said earlier in the conference, that so much of ending homelessness comes down to leadership. And Edmonton's success is due, I think, in no small measure to the leadership of Susan McGee and Homeward Trust here in Edmonton. Susan is, and continues to be one of the most effective leaders we see in the sector, but she's also been very generous in sharing her knowledge, sharing with many of you. We are all benefiting from the work of Homeward Trust and Susan, and she has also been, I know Adam Vaughn is here in front, has been a very effective advocate for Edmonton and for ending homelessness on a national and provincial stage. And I'll invite her up on behalf of the 7 cities in homelessness and housing in Alberta to introduce our keynote speaker, Susan McGee.
Thank you very much, Tim. And I know we want to leave as much time as possible for our speaker. We're really excited to hear from, but I think I said this in Hamilton, and I'm going to repeat it because I have so many amazing colleagues and organizations that we work with in the room. I'm going to get emotional. That's super weird. Okay. Anyway, one of the things about this work, and there's lots of questions about how we up our game and do this every day and maintain the momentum. And I think that what I really want to say that, and for me to steal a sports analogy is very weird for any of you that know me. But to steal one, I think that if you want to get better at anything, you play with people better than you. And I have the opportunity to do that every day in my community. So if you haven't had a chance to meet our staff, or many of the agencies that are here that we work with, they're amazing. And just congratulations to all of you guys, because you made this possible. Yeah, that's really weird. I don't get emotional. I think Ian de Jong's in the room. He always makes me emotional, so that's probably why. Anyway, the other thing that I want to say about my community is we are definitely an and community. I think this There's a lot of conversations in this space about can we do this without ending poverty, without, you know, the things we're going to talk about this afternoon and the incredible pressures on our system and youth homelessness. We're an and community, and we need to end chronic homelessness, and we need to prevent homelessness from becoming a reality for anybody in the future, and we need to end poverty. So we're an and community, and I think that's huge for us. So on behalf of 7 cities, and I'm super excited to be able to host with my colleagues in 6 other communities in Alberta your lunch and to sponsor it today, and then this evening's push showing as well. I want to recognize them. Actually, 7 Cities has been meeting since 1999 with the first federal program that was launched as, at the time, Skippy. It's fabulous, actually, that Claudette Bradshaw is here and was such an amazing force behind that early program. And since then, we have, I think, collectively, can feel very confident that we've been that movement that has created a plan to end homelessness in our province. There's been lots of people that have come and gone, and I have benefited immensely professionally from the support of the communities that I work with, and we continue to meet and support each other in implementing our local plans, as well as ensuring that there remains a focus on ending homelessness in our province today. So I'm just going to quickly recognize them. I know that a couple couldn't make it, but around our table these days, 7 Cities is led by Catherine Shepherd in the city of Grand Prairie. Katrin Downey, yes. I know she's actually having to work today back home. I really am missing her. Caitlin Downey from the regional municipality of Wood Buffalo. Tricia Hersina from the city of Red Deer. Diana Cressy from the Calgary Homeless Foundation. Jamie Rogers from the Medicine Hat Community Housing Society. And Marty Thompson from the city of Lethbridge. And they would kill me if I didn't say this, they are also supported in their communities by fabulous organizations and other leadership that does work directly with 7 Cities as well. So thank you to all of my colleagues, and on their behalf, it's my honor to introduce this afternoon's speaker, Cindy Blackstock, the Executive Director, we've all been waiting for, the Executive Director of the First Nations Child and Family Caring Society of Canada, a member of the Gitxsan First Nation. Cindy has 25 years of social work experience in child protection and Indigenous children's rights. Her promotion of culturally based and evidence-informed solutions have been recognized by the Nobel Women's Initiative, the Aboriginal Achievement Foundation, Frontline Defenders, and many, many others. An author of over 50 publications and a widely sought-after public speaker, Cindy has collaborated with other Indigenous leaders to assist the United Nations Committee on the Rights of the Child in the development and adoption of a general comment on the rights of Indigenous children. Please join me in welcoming our speaker, Cindy Blackstock.
What a great honor to be here on Treaty 6 territory and on Métis Week. Thank you. Superheroes are popular again. All you have to do is go to any elementary school or open your door on Halloween and there is Batman and Superwoman and every other rescuer you'd want. Now, I'm old enough to know when they were cool the first time, and what you may not know, but what I want you to realize by the time you leave this luncheon is that every single one of you is a superhero for First Nations children. And every single one of you needs to pick up those bookmarks because you can make an end to the end of racial discrimination against First Nations kids in this country. We can do it. We just need to do it together. Sometimes governments need our help to realize that. You know, if there's a lot of elections going on at the moment. We just had one federally, and I know that you just had one provincially. And one of the things that we're often told by various governments is that kids are really important, and they're right about that. Kids are actually the very best investment any government can make. Unfortunately, investing in people my age is not so much of a good investment. But investing in kids, especially young kids, we know returns about $18 on every dollar spent. So they're the best investment. But why is it that kids are often left off the budget sheet? Why are they always too often considered an expense instead of one of the fundamental best investments any government can make? And the other thing that we need to realize is that even if you achieve your goal of ending homelessness, we will still have people who do not have equal opportunity unless we take that broader vision of ending all inequality wherever it exists. It must be a pledge to ending all inequality. Above you, behind me on the screens is a study that I was recently privileged to play a small part in. It was chaired by Sir Michael Marmot, one of the world's gurus on health equity. And you've all heard about the determinants of health, and that's been driving a lot of work, including a lot of the important work you're doing. But unfortunately, it's missing a lot of pieces. And particularly for First Nations, Métis, or Inuit peoples, it's missing a lot of pieces. So in this framework, we actually have, for the first time in an international report on health equity, the land as a determinant of health. Not just climate change, but in the end, it is all of our home. And unless we take care of that home, it doesn't matter how many houses we build on it, we're all going to be unsafe. We owe her that duty. And it's not just about climate change, it's about the sacred relationship with ancestors that come from that land. The other piece is self-determination. The right to be self-determining is a determinant of health. And one of the key components of colonialism is that other people started dreaming what we should do for our children, and other people started dreaming about the way they should be cared for. And for that, we've now had at least 2 national apologies, and we're working on a 3rd. We need to realize at the end of the day, as you realize it, that it's people's own best choices to care for their kids. Their nations know what's best. And the other thing that this recognizes is colonialism in its past and present forms interferes with the determinants of health across all those dimensions. And colonialism, at the end of the day, if you put it really simply, is very simply this. It is a dichotomy between the savage and the civilized, where First Nations, Métis, and Inuit are considered to be the savages, and everything else is the civilized. And that means we dehumanize those folks, and we allow them to be treated in ways that would be considered intolerable for others. Now, what about investments in kids? Well, we actually have an independent international ranking on that. Every year, a group called the Kids' Rights Foundation puts out a record of how well countries are doing for kids proportionate to their wealth. Now, this is for all children in Canada. Last year, we ranked 49th in the world. And if you take the sub-index, which is a child rights environment that looks at budgets and legislation, 2 things that are right in the wheelhouse of governments, we ranked 138th in the world, well behind many third world countries. So clearly, there's a lot of room for Canada to be investing far more legislative time and far more of its budget into children. Now here's the kicker. Since Confederation, the federal government has funded services on reserve. The provinces have funded it for others. And since Confederation, all those public services have been underfunded significantly. That does 2 things. One is it compounds the trauma of other colonial efforts, such as residential schools, the 60s scoop, the taking of land. All of that is compounded. It makes it harder for people by these inequalities. The second thing it does, it means there's fewer services to help you with that added trauma. So First Nations folks get this double whammy. And then they're judged by caring Canadians who don't know any better as if they're getting more, not less, right? Why aren't you thankful for all the good things we're doing for you is often the question. And that's our shared challenge, is to bring people back to that reality. Now, we've had an opportunity, and this is it. It's a Spirit Bear plan. This could end all inequalities for First Nations kids. Part 1, figure out why the federal government doesn't do better when it knows better. What is it about the psyche of the department and the way it's structured that makes these decisions for kids that are repeatedly wrong? are often wrong. Through residential schools, through the 60s group, and we're going to talk about the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal decision shortly. The second part is get the parliamentary budget officer to cost out all the inequalities in housing, in water, in child welfare, in juvenile justice, in safe play spaces for kids to play. Let's figure out what the big ticket of that inequality is and then launch something like the Marshall Plan after the Second World War to do it, deal with it. Because this program by program, drop by drop approach amounts to nothing more than the perpetuation of racial discrimination as fiscal policy against children. And in 2019, we should be beyond that. No government should be allowed to continue that, right? Why aren't we doing better? Some ways we are. There's been small amounts of progress, but we cannot satisfy ourselves with small amounts of progress when that still means that kids are getting racially discriminated against. It's not because we don't know better. That would be nice if we didn't know what the solutions were, because then we can say, well, we're trying our best, but we don't know any better. But that also is not true. It's never been true. We can also say that people back then, during residential schools, they didn't know any better. They had different values and morals at the time. Well, that would make us feel better, because we would say that we're now informed and we would know if something was going on. But that is also wrong. And that's what's created, I think, so much of the outrage when the Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women and Girls report came out with the word genocide. And people offered opinions about whether or not the history of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit women and girls amounted to genocide, and often these people offering opinions had never even really opened up a history book about that particular history. And they haven't really studied what genocide is. These are the 8 stages of genocide, as chronicled by a guy named Stanton. Now, if we look at classification, we are the only country in the Western industrialized world with an Indian Act. I want you to think about that for a moment. We have an Indian Act. We have a Department of Indian Affairs. We hand out status cards to children who we say are eligible for status as being First Nations, and other children are told they're not status First Nations. Not because their community doesn't recognize them, but because the government makes a choice about who counts and who doesn't. Symbolization can happen both in symbols and stereotypes. Where we stereotype everything, we say, for example, around the economic inequalities, it's because First Nations folks can't manage their money. Well, I'm sure there are some First Nations folks who can't manage their money. But I live in Ottawa. And I work in Montreal. And for those of you who don't know much about Montreal, they had just gone through, I think, about 3 mayors a couple years ago for racketeering and fraud. But nobody was pushing a Francophone white male Financial Accountability Act. Dehumanization. It's legitimizing and making excuses for treating people for less than who they are. Polarization, developing polarizing society by the perpetuation of stereotypes like not educating, caring non-Indigenous people that First Nations are getting less. Preparation, really starting the ground so that this type of systemic discrimination can continue. And then extermination, which of course is the deaths of persons. And then there's the big kicker, which is denial, right? Everything gets denied in a genocide because no one wants to be morally culpable. So I decided I'd launch a Twitter series because I wanted to, in my own small way, honor the testimonies of the murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls. But I'm just going to focus on the Twitters that I put up on relevant to child welfare. And you can see the whole series. Before I get there, though, I want to talk about the word racism. Because a lot of people use this word, but they don't know where it comes from. And while this is a matter of some debate among historians, there's a fairly good consensus that this guy founded it. His name is General Pratt. He was a U.S. general, and he actually used to rule over U.S. military prisons back in the day. But after he kind of completed his term looking at U.S. military prisons, the U.S. government deployed him to a new post, and that was Carlisle Industrial School for Native American children. They're one of the very first residential schools, if you like. For those of you who know Canadian history, John A. Macdonald sent down this guy named Nicholas Flood Davin, who's the founder of the Regina Leader. Anyone from Regina here? Yeah, a few from Regina. And they sent him down to Carlisle Residential School to write something called the Davin Report, which unleashed residential schools in Canada. This is him in the photograph. And I want to read from you from 1902 what he says here. Segregating any class or race of people apart from the rest of people kills the progress of the segregated people. Now we can see the racism there, right? Don't want the savages civilized, separated from everybody else, because then it makes it harder for them to be like us, or makes their growth very slow. Association of the races and classes is necessary to destroy racism and classism. That is one of the very first uses of the word racism. And it was said by a man who would go on to say, kill the Indian in the man, right? Let's talk about Canada's DNA of racism towards children. This is an 1895 warrant. It was requested from the Department of Justice by the acting superintendent of Indian Affairs, a man by the name of Duncan Campbell Scott, who was hired by John A. Macdonald for the small price of $1.50. And his dad was friends with John A. That's how he used to get jobs in the public service back then. And what it allows for is the removal of First Nations children and their placement in residential schools for the purposes of, quote, education, which we know from listening to the survivors of the TRC in this very building is not that. But there was another reason. It was because they were, quote, not properly cared for. And if you look at the regulations of not properly cared for, they closely map onto contemporary definitions of neglect and child welfare. And they both have the same problem, is that they codified structural and state-based discrimination as a personal deficit. They didn't take account of the fact of residential schools, the fact that First Nations were being starved off the plains in order to run through the railway, the fact that there was the killing off of the buffalo. None of that was taken into consideration. It was a fact that you weren't properly caring for your kids. So residential schools are key in this piece. They were child welfare from their inception. Now let's think this idea of the savage and civilized. The idea is that the civilized are going to take the savage kids and make sure they are properly cared for. But some of the places that they put them in were far from that. And one was St. Anne's Residential School. And this is a story of a little girl in one of those places where she was supposed to be properly cared for. She told investigators it was grayish beige in color and made from tough material like denim, with zippers down the back and the front. The sleeves had fringes to bind the arms together across the front and bindings to secure the hands together behind the neck. She said during a second interview with the OPP, that's the Ontario Provincial Police, on August 10th, 1994. She's talking about a straitjacket. She was being put into an electric chair that was made by the clergy who would shock the kids for entertainment or for discipline. This is not an unusual story. I know that you had been blessed with the presence of Willie Littlechild just yesterday, who has shared the stories of the electric fences around the residential schools here in Alberta. So what did people of the period back then know about residential schools? Well, this is the front page of the Ottawa Citizen newspaper, then called the Evening Citizen newspaper in 1907. This story, by the way, was carried by newspapers across Canada. And what it is, it's a story of the chief medical health officer, a white bureaucrat named Dr. Peter Henderson Bryce, who was sent out by Duncan Campbell Scott to find out what was happening with the health of kids in residential school. And what he found is that the kids were dying at a rate of 25% a year. And if you track the kids over 3 years, 48% of them were dead. What did Bryce say when he got back to Ottawa? Medical science knows just what to do. He noticed that the healthcare funding for all the citizens in Ottawa was 3 times more than for all First Nations across Canada. He said, even out that healthcare funding and put in practical reforms like not putting sick kids in with healthy kids, making sure the kids weren't exhausted, making sure they were well fed, making sure the buildings were ventilated, you could save many of these lives. The cost of Dr. Bryce's reforms back in 1907, roughly $10,000 to $15,000. Let's go with a higher amount, $15,000. You might say to yourself, that's a lot of money back then, and you would be right. Except, the Canada's national budget back then was $100 million. We just saw 2 weeks ago the names of the children who died in residential schools being released by the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation. Those are many of the kids that would have been saved had Canada listened to Dr. Bryce, but they didn't. And somehow his report gets leaked to the Ottawa Citizen newspaper, the Evening Citizen, and no one knows for sure who did it, but Dr. Bryce is the key suspect, and Canada thought so too. And what did they do? They retaliated against Dr. Bryce. They cut his research funding, they denied him positions for which he was eminently qualified for, and they erased him out of Canadian history. But his report got into the public, and then what did people like you reading the newspaper thought? Well, here's one example. This is Samuel Hume Blake, a lawyer, later a judge. And he says that in that Canada fails to obviate the preventable causes of death, it brings itself into unpleasant nearness with manslaughter. So people of that period knew that this type of unequal treatment causing death was not only immoral, it was quite likely illegal. So there's Duncan Campbell Scott. He was really a moral coward. He also, though, was a Confederate poet, by all reports a loving father, and by all reports a very skilled musician. He went on to receive for his loyalty to the government all kinds of accolades. In fact, when he retired, they had a huge reception for him as a loyal public servant. In the closest thing to a lament, just before Scott died, he writes a letter to his editor. We know this from John Malloy's great book, A National Crime. He writes a letter to his editor, and he says, I have never done anything courageous in my entire life. So we have the moral, courageous Bryce who gets erased from history, and the moral coward who gets accolades. And that very much is still very much a contemporary story. Let's skip ahead here. Those are some of the pictures, real pictures of children that could have been saved by Dr. Bryce. This was actually from the Yukon Territory. Those are pictures of children who died of TB after Bryce's report was released, right? So the deaths of children related to the inequality wasn't just theoretical. It was clearly there, right? Now let's go to the 1940s. What were people saying back then about this? Well, this is a paper released by a social worker, Mary Twig. We got to give her due. Mary Twig Woodward. And she's writing a master's of social work paper for the University of British Columbia. And she's looking at delinquent girls, that's what we were called back then, troublemaking girls, and inequality, right? And what she says is the conclusion is drawn from the fate of these Indian girls must promote greater awareness on the part of social work is playing in helping other Indian children. The conditions under which the Indians live are a discredit to Canadian welfare standards. That was 60 years ago. And this recommendation could be something we see today. Let's move on. This is 1946. It's a joint submission by the Canadian Association of Social Workers and a Canadian Welfare Council. It's about the Indian Act. And in there, social workers are not saying that residential schools should be closed. In fact, they're favoring assimilation. But what they do point out is these gross inequalities in the provision of public services. And so they talk about the fact that First Nations, or Indian children as we were called then, were receiving far fewer public services, and that was driving these kids into state care unnecessarily. 1946. I wasn't even born yet in 1946. 1967. This is a report by George Caldwell. 1967 was an important year because it was Canada's 100th birthday. And so the Department of Indian Affairs was requisitioning all these reports about Indian kids, and this is just one example. I've got numbers of them in my office because I like old papers. And this is, Caldwell was sent out to see what was happening with kids in residential schools, in Saskatchewan in this case. And what he found is that by then, as John Malloy, the historian, has already documented in his book, by the 1950s, the vast majority of First Nations kids in residential schools were there for that neglect provision. And he finds that 80% of them were there for child welfare reasons. This is 1967. But his keynote recommendation is that the agency will need to direct more resources and energy into services for children in their own homes. Does this sound familiar? And where alternative care is provided or required, homes in Indian community should be helped to provide the service. This was right to the Indian Affairs Department in 1967. I was 3 years old then. Three years old. In 1996, we had the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples, which provided a 20-year plan to get out of the Indian Act. It was never implemented, so we still have that horrible Indian Act today. But one of the recommendations it pointed to was, again, to address these inequalities. As many of you know, First Nations agencies started to establish in the 70s and 80s, and the reason for that was the 60s scoop and the mass removals of kids. The Canadian government said, yes, First Nations, you can establish your own child welfare agencies, but there's two conditions. One is you use provincial laws. Second is we're going to underfund you. They didn't say underfund you, they said fund you. And so these agencies were put in a position to implement laws that were not culturally appropriate with a lot less money than everybody else. And this is what the Royal Commission is talking about. Aboriginal agencies have inherited many of the problems of the agencies they replaced. They struggle with ill-fitting rules made outside of their communities and levels of family and distress and needs beyond their limited resources. That is 1996. And this is in evidence at 2013. In 2007, we at the Assembly of First Nations and the Caring Society filed a human rights case against Canada, saying their failure to fund child welfare services on reserve and in the Yukon in ways that were comparable to non-Indigenous kids, and their chronic underfunding of other services and failure to implement something called Jordan's Principle, which ensures First Nations kids can get services they need when they need them, was racially discriminatory. For 9 years, Canada fought that case tooth and nail on legal technicalities. And part of those legal technicalities meant that we did not get to trial until 2013. Now you might wonder, were they fighting because they knew we were wrong? Well, this is one of the documents the federal government actually filed as evidence. It's written by the federal government. There was no input by First Nations. And what it shows is if you're a First Nations kid and you needed a wheelchair, a lift, and a stroller, you would take 15 years to get all that equipment because you're only entitled to one piece every 5 years. Whereas a non-Indigenous kid with the same needs would get all those pieces of equipment when they're required. Right? In 2007, Jordan's Principle, which is named in memory of Jordan River Anderson, was passed through the House of Commons. We thought it was then going to be the end of that kind of discrimination. But the federal government stood up and voted for it, all the parties in all the parliament did, and then they constructed a definition so narrow that no child ever qualified. And during that time when no child would ever qualify, we saw in the government's own documents evidence of horrible tragedies. One family had 2 terminally ill children, and they had to try and hand wash the feeding tubes because Canada capped the number of feeding tubes that they would provide to low-income kids. A 4-year-old little girl who was in palliative care was going to be discharged home for her last Christmas. She needed a bed to be held at an incline of 30 degrees so she would not suffocate. The request for the bed goes through the hands of 15 different bureaucrats in the federal government before someone writes on there, absolutely not. A doctor with a bigger heart than the government approved the beds and paid for it himself so she could go home. But the people who said no in the public service, and I need to say I believe in the goodness of people, but the system itself is constructed so that it makes these racist decisions. The people who said no were nominated by the Deputy Minister of Indigenous Affairs for the highest public service award in 2012, and they received it. So not only was racism and saying no in these circumstances normative in Canadian government, it was award-winning in the Canadian government. And that's a copy of the actual nomination form right there. So we get to the decision in 2016. Canada is found to be racially discriminating against 165,000 kids. It was well covered in the news for the first couple of days, and then it fell off the front cover of the newspapers because we, the people of this period, did not keep it on the front page. But what did the panel have to say about Canada's arguments? Well, they said overall, the panel finds ANSI, they changed their name quite a bit, but it's the same department, position unreasonable, unconvincing, and not supported by the preponderance of evidence. This was a historic day. Nowhere in the Western world have we had a government on trial before a body that can make orders against it for its treatment of Indigenous children. Nowhere in the world had this happened before. It was ordered to immediately cease its discriminatory behavior, not discuss decreasing it, not waiting for the next budget to eliminate it, immediately eliminate it. So we waited. They welcomed the decision, they did nothing. And then they released a budget, and they said that $71 million would fill the gap. Well, we knew it wouldn't fill that gap, and what we found out later is that that budget was actually made under the previous government regime, the Conservatives in that case, and it was never altered when the tribunal decision came out. So this wasn't a response, that budget wasn't a response to the order at all. So here's Jordan's Principle. Jordan's Principle, though, thankfully, after 10 legal orders, non-compliance orders against Canadian government since 2016. But since 2017, there's been clear rules set down in law about Jordan's Principle. Jordan's Principle applies to all public services. It applies to all First Nations kids. Although we're litigating against Canada for their failure to apply it properly for First Nations children recognized by their nations off reserve, but who do not have status. That's still outstanding. And substantive equality applies. What that means is First Nations kids have been denied services available to everybody else. for a long period of time. So we're going to have to invest more in those kids to give them the same opportunity as everybody else. Thankfully, resulting from this decision, this slide's, I should have updated it. Last year, Canada provided 250,000 services and products to First Nations kids that would have otherwise been denied. So that's a good thing, and that's a way of honoring Jordan River Anderson, the founder of Jordan's Principle. But it gives you a sense of how deep the inequality is. There are several ways you can file in Jordan's Principle cases: individual, group, and also retroactive cases. And here's the most important slide. That's where you can refer a family. So if you know of a First Nations family who needs services, you can call this 24-hour line and make that referral. All you need is a professional note, or if it's for a cultural service, a note from an elder or a knowledge keeper to be able to say this is what the child needs. And theoretically, they should get it. But we're still litigating because the system is still not perfect. What about Bill C-92? The government has said that this is the answer, is giving jurisdiction to First Nations. I agree with that, but here's the problem. This is where I differ from the government. Is the government thinks funding is different than jurisdiction. So there's no positive funding obligation in Bill C-92 for the federal government. So you could actually end up with your own law and no money to operate it, which is not jurisdiction, right? No child welfare system in the Western industrialized world operates without public money. Jiffy Lube tried it in Texas, but they got out of the business because they realized it was not something to make a profit at. Where are we now? Well, the tribunal in September found that Canada is still willfully and recklessly discriminating against First Nations children in the ways that contribute to the deaths of some children and contribute to the family separations unnecessarily of hundreds and thousands of others. And to give you a sense of the scale, between 1989 and 2012, the number of sleeps that First Nations kids spent in foster care was 67 million. That's what we're talking about. So the tribunal awarded the maximum damages of $40,000 per victim of discrimination. The federal government has chosen to judicially review that decision. In their legal documents, they ask to quash all financial compensation to these victims. They make arguments about irrevocable harm, but not for the children. They talk about the irrevocable harm to the government. They say it'll cost them $8 billion, which is a lot of money, until, just like if we go back to Bryce and Scott, we consider the fact that the annual federal budget's roughly $300 billion. And the amount is only so large because Canada discriminated against so many children. And I don't think, personally, that Canada should be able to use the amount of children they discriminated against as a shield towards meeting its obligations to each individual child that they discriminated against. So, we are going to court on November 25th and 26th of this year, and we hope that all of you will be sending your prayers and letting your friends and neighbors know. The Aboriginal People's Television Network is asked to broadcast it. The Caring Society's consented. I'm hoping all the parties will, and then all of you can watch it live. We have some resources because one of the things that's really important to us that we've seen throughout the 13 years of this case is that children get it. Children know fairness at age 2. And so we have a program called I Am a Witness where we invite everyone to read and watch all of Canada's documents, read and watch all of ours, and then make up your own mind. And we invited people to come to the courtroom, but no one really was showing up. Until 2009, that all changed, when a group of school children started coming to the tribunal. In fact, they were from alternative school. One boy said to me, "We're from alternative school, which means we get into trouble a lot." I said, "Good, so do I." And I think we need to raise a generation of young people who get into trouble for doing the right thing, because any fool can get into trouble for doing the wrong thing, is what I told them, right? By 2012, so many children were coming to the hearings that we had to book them in shifts. And we are expecting more children to show up on the 25th and 26th. And if you want to learn how children are making a difference in these kinds of contemporary struggles for justice, you can buy the book Spirit Bearer Children Make History outside at the bookshop. All the proceeds go to children's reconciliation programs. And we have Cree and Carrier versions free online. We don't charge for the First Nations versions. Those are all the case citations. We've now had 16 orders. The score for the kids, by the way, is 15-1, and the one decision Canada won was overturned by the federal court. So the kids are pretty good lawyers as things turns out. This is where all of you come in. If you don't want to be that person who's sitting on the bench when First Nations kids needed you the most, this is your time. Pick up that bookmark. There are 7 free ways. You don't even need to have a penny in your pocket to help. 7 free ways for everyone in this room and all your friends and neighbors to make a difference by ending this inequality and showing this generation that we love them enough to stand up for them. Because you all have important roles in your communities. Some of you got very important jobs. Some of you are very important neighbors and caregivers. But the most important job we all have is to stand up for kids when they need us. So be their superheroes. And let's today all vow to raise a generation of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit kids who never have to recover from their childhoods, and a generation of non-Indigenous kids who never have to say their story. Thank you very much.
Wow. Cindy, thank you very much for a very, very clear and very, very powerful call to action. We do know better, don't we? So we must do better. I will say that the Alliance is very pleased and will support the Spirit Bear plan. She has given us 7 free ways to make a difference, but I think all of you, all of us can be those superheroes for these children. Before I send you on your way, there is somebody that I need to recognize, and I'll ask Bev Allard here to stand up. In introducing everybody, I completely forgot Bev. Now, Beverly from Homeward Trust has organized the teepee and the Sacred Fire, has organized and supported all our elders, has organized the market downstairs, and the drummers, and a whole lot of other things, and I completely forgot. Beverly, thank you very much.